So in building this cockpit, I've spent probably about £1,100. I've totted it all up now. These are all my receipts. I've done a rough total and I tried to break it down a little bit. And the breakdown really is £600 of that more or less is the electronics and the things to support the construction of that, so the wires and so on. And again, breaking that down, the bottom of the boards were a significant proportion. The switches and so on, I haven't really broken it down that far, but the switches are probably like £150, and then the construction of the frame and so on. The other thing obviously that doesn't take into account is all the parts I had beforehand. Is it worth doing something like this? Absolutely yes. I mean, it's just been a hugely satisfying thing to do. It's just great fun. But more than that, I mean, now I'm at the stage, you know, it's not technically finished really. I've got things like the exposed wood and stuff. If you watch some of the videos, you'll still see some of that. But I've stopped doing that for now because I'm just flying it around, and it's just so much more fun to experiment with the Twin Otter systems when you don't have to worry about fiddly buttons in the virtual cockpit. Everything's to hand. So I've been doing that, and you've probably noticed I've been doing some videos about the autopilot, and I'm learning about the autopilot. I'm still experimenting with that. I've done 2 autopilot videos, got 1 more to do, and I might do some more of that, similar sort of stuff. What I quite like doing is just to ride along, you know, doing this, I'm going here, I'm figuring this out, ride along and see. I'm still quite impressed with this Twin Otter extended implementation. The autopilot is what I've been focusing on at the moment. I've got some documentation here. This is not the Aerosoft documentation. This is, I can't remember where I got this, on the web somewhere. And it's actually for a different aircraft. It's for the Beechcraft C-12, which is a similar class of aircraft, if you like. It's a twin turboprop, but it's got the same autopilot fitted, the AP106. And given that this is a detailed description of the real-world autopilot, pretty much everything it says in here applies to the Aerosoft implementation. The only thing that I think that's missing is there's an extra function in the nav mode which is called linear deviation. So if you're tracking a VORTAC instead of the straightforward VOR, you can actually fly a parallel track to a radial. So you can be tracking a radial but be flying parallel to it a linear distance off track, if that makes sense. That would be a really useful function. And in fact, what I'm going to do is, for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to also switch my generators on. Forgot to do that. I think I've done something. I think my engines have stopped. That wasn't part of the plan. Oh dear. Right. Luckily we got over that ridge. We got a bit of gliding distance here. I'm not sure what happened there. I switched my generators off. That's what happened. And because I was on external battery instead of internal battery to do the start, that's messed things up. Okay, everything's back. I need to switch off the generators and restart the engines. Most people that have seen my custom built external screen GPS have been pretty impressed, and I'm pretty pleased with it myself, but it's not perfect, and there's one very specific issue with it that pretty much renders the thing barely usable in some ways. So I'm going to just try and explain that. The solution's going to involve ditching the Aerosoft built-in GPS. I'm not ditching it, you can't ditch it, it's built into the virtual cockpit, but I've bought the Reality XP GNS 530. So what we've got here, if you can see, is we've got an embarrassment of GPSs. We've got this set up very artificially, obviously. So over here we've got, this is the virtual cockpit GNS 530 in the Twin Otter Extended, and below it we've got the 2D version of the same panel, which I've opened and carefully positioned. And I should say these are sized at about the same size as they are on my other thing you can't see, which is my external 7-inch monitor, which is where I normally run the GPS. To the top left of that we've got the Reality XP Garmin GNS 530. That's the real deal, again resized to be about the same. And at the bottom left, just for further comparison, we've got the FSX default Garmin GPS 500, it says on there. And currently we're just kind of orbiting roughly a couple of thousand feet over Harvey Field in Washington State. And just out of interest, what you can see over on the left at the extreme left of the screen is the Reality XP GPS, but it's the window only. So we haven't got the border, the bezels with the buttons and knobs. I figured out how, well I didn't figure out how to do that, I found out how to do that just by googling for it. Now that's fantastic for using on the external monitor. I just need to drag it there and size it to the appropriate size and shape. So for our purposes, why are we looking at this? Well, if you look at these two on the right, the virtual cockpit GPS is pretty much mirrored, so you can see we've got everything that's shown on the virtual cockpit is shown on the 2D panel as well. We zoomed to a 20 miles radius, so the top to the bottom of the display is 20 miles, and we can see the airspace, we can see a couple of airfields, we can see the ILS feathers and so on. Actually the ILS feathers are not shown on the, I've just noticed on the virtual cockpit. I'm not sure why that is, maybe that's a setup thing. But it looks pretty good. So the problem with this isn't immediately obvious, but if I try and move it onto my external monitor, first thing you're going to notice is it's too small for the monitor. So we've got to resize it, and because we don't want to see the bezels and the knobs and things, we actually want to resize it bigger than the monitor. So I'm going to temporarily move it back onto the main screen, and I'm going to resize it. So that's the size that I'm going to need to drag it back onto my external monitor. Now you may not have noticed the problem, but if I point it out, if you look at the labels and the icons for the airfields and the VORs and the NDBs and so on, they're the same size on this resized, much bigger display as they are on in the virtual cockpit. In fact, it's worse than that because they're actually smaller on that very much enlarged GPS. They're quite readable at this size, but the point is they're exactly the same size as they were when the GPS was this size. That means they're not being resized. The labels are basically being drawn at a constant scale, regardless of the size that we make the window. And if I just, by contrast, do the same trick with the Reality XP GPS, move this onto that screen, I'll just roughly size it to the same size as the screen, we see there's a difference. We can see those labels are much bigger than they were when the window was smaller. So in other words, they're being resized up as the window is scaled. And as another experiment, if we take the standard GPS 500 and we do the same trick with that, and again we see we're stuck with these little tiny labels that are drawn at the same size regardless of what you do to the size of the window. So let's check that out by comparing how these look on the small screen. First I'm going to move the Aerosoft 2D panel with approximately the right size onto the small screen. But there you can see the airport over here is a good size, but the labels are tiny, and the icons for the NDBs and the VORs and the other airports, that's a major airport, but there's the minor airports, they're very small. Basically those labels are unreadable. That's the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended Fake GNS 530. If we try the standard Garmin 500, you can just about make out the text at this zoom factor. They're barely readable. So that's the standard GPS, and the last thing we're going to try the Reality XP genuine GN 530, resized approximately. It's a little bit small, but it fits on. And as you can see, those labels are perfectly readable, and they've been resized completely appropriately for the size of the display, and that's what we need. We get a perfectly readable GPS display, and all the labels are very easily readable, unlike on either the default GPS or the 2D panel that comes with the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended. If you look up here on my panel, there's a button that's labelled Sync All Controls. So what happens is, quite often, you kind of sloppily shut down the aircraft, willing to in fact stop the flight without shutting down the aircraft. So you come back to reload it, and you can either reload it cold and dark or ready to fly. A lot of the switches are out of sync. In fact, we'll just demonstrate, rather than me talk about this, let's just demonstrate that, and then we'll see what I've done to fix it. We've loaded the ready to fly configuration, but what usually happens is, if we're not conscientious about shutting down the aircraft correctly, we just stop the flight and shut down the computer. When we start up, depending on which state we start up in, some of the switches are out of sync with the functions in the aircraft. I mean, obviously this is worse if you want to start up cold and dark and you haven't shut it down to cold and dark properly. In fact, we're going to simulate that. So if I bring up the configuration page and I set it to the cold and dark configuration, so we'll wait a couple of seconds for that to sort itself out. So in the aircraft, of course, we've got the control locks on everything's off, and if we look at, for example, the master switch is off, external battery is off, and so on. But if we look at the panel, we're going to see that the switches are set incorrectly. So for example, my control lock switch currently says free, the parking brake switch is actually off, and yet the parking brake is set in the virtual cockpit. What else? My generators are switched on, my DC master is on, my external battery switch is set to battery. What else? Got anti-collision lights on, bleed air is on, and lots of other things as well, which we needn't go into. And that's not realistic. So what I've done is I've written a piece of software to sort that out, and I'm just going to demonstrate that. We've loaded cold and dark, so we know that all the switches are set to off in the cockpit. What I'm going to do is, and you just have to trust me that the switches are set in my cockpit as I say they are. So let's demonstrate that. I've hooked up the function that I've written to do this to the autopilot test button, which is a button that's easy to hand. So when I press that, it's going to run the function, and we'll just set up a few other things artificially to make it obvious that that's had the desired effect. So what we're going to do is let's put on the windscreen wipers, we'll switch those to on. We're going to switch on the cabin flight compartment lights. What else? We'll put on, what we'll do is we'll turn the left generator off and leave the right one on. So we should have an indicator light for the left generator. What I'll do is as well, on the start panel, I'll put the ignition to manual, and we'll put the left, or in fact the right, why not? The right engine igniter, we'll put that switch to use the number 1 igniter only. Again, because that's just, we can easily check that. That'll do, really. What else? I'll put the left wing tank boost pump on as well, because again we can easily spot that. So that's all we need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that function by pressing the test button, and it takes a little while to execute. We've got a legend up here that says it's scanning the joysticks in turn. Now it's doing all the off settings and now all the on settings. Okay, so what's it done? Well, it's turned on the windscreen wipers, the cabin lights are on. I don't know if they went off and then came on again. We've got a left generator warning light, which is what we should have. The control locks are off, the parking brake is off. I can tell that if I reset it, you should see it move. Yeah, what else did I'm going to turn those windscreen wipers off, they're getting away. Oh, the generator, I said that. The wing tanks, boost pumps there, hard to see, they're behind the yoke. You should see the right wing tank is off, the left wing tank switch is up. So that was, and I'll just turn it down, off again. There it goes. What else did we do? Parking brake. Oh, the ignition switches, the ignition set to manual. You can see the switch guard is up there. If I put it down, it goes back. If I just put that up again, out of the way, you can see the igniter switch is in the up position, number 1's position for the right hand engine, and it's in the down position for the left hand engine. Again, if I reset that. So basically we can run that function whenever we want if we map it to a button, and the button I'll map it to is the one I originally designed for that purpose, and that means we have to start to worry about shutting the aircraft down correctly. And that just makes things more realistic, because we can never be out of sync between the virtual cockpit and the hardware switches. Now, it's not perfect. You probably noticed somewhere in there that although it was cold and dark, my Reality XP GPS was on, and then when I synchronized the switches, that actually went off. Now, again, another rough edge with the Reality XP, there is no power on and power off command. There's a power on off toggle. So that we can't synchronize that. Anything that works on a toggle, we can't synchronize it, because we can't possibly know what the state of it is by looking at the state of the switch. And the other thing to note, of course, is that synchronizing the switches doesn't synchronize the state of the aircraft. It doesn't, for example, from cold and dark, although we've got all the switches set as they were when the engines were running, it doesn't start the engines for us. All it does is resets the switches in the virtual cockpit. So that's to be expected. So that's a great feature, and it works fantastic. It's all done in Lua, and I was going to say it's easy to do. It's not easy to do actually. It uses the Lua COM library, which allows you to interrogate HID devices, those are joysticks, human interface devices, and do things like check the positions of the switches. And then once you've checked the positions of the switches, I mean basically that's all I do. I go through methodically for every joystick that it detects connected to the system. It looks at every button and notes the state, and if it finds a switch that's set to on, all it does is it calls the function that we've mapped to that switch in our Linda setup. And for buttons that are off, again it calls the function. If there's a function mapped to the off operation for that switch, it calls that function. Well, I never thought this day would come, but about a week ago I got this. This is the long-awaited Iris Dragonfly force feedback yoke. Now it may look like a CH Eclipse yoke to the untrained eye, and that's because this yoke ships without a handle, so you need to make your own arrangements for a handle. I say it ships without a handle. The Kickstarter backers do receive a handle of sorts, and it's a demonstration handle essentially that you want to throw in the bin right away and replace with something more usable. I'm not going to say too much about this yoke because I am going to do a proper review of it at some point. So what I've managed to do is I've mounted this, and actually the CH controller board is inside this handle as well, and there's one USB lead, I don't know if you can see that, goes from that controller board and just is plugged into a USB socket. A few headlines of this yoke. Force feedback, what does that do? Well, I'm going to go into that in more detail in my review, but the first thing it means, you can see the yoke moving in the cockpit here as well, but one of the first things you're going to notice is in the rest position the yoke is fully forward, and that's because it's simulating the software is simulating the weight of the elevators. You know, that's just something that you don't get with your two springs in a box yoke. Something else, two things of note. You're going to notice, rather like in my Cytec Cessna yoke review, we've got a full 180 degrees of travel in this yoke. It's actually quoted as 200 degrees, so it's more than 180 degrees. So that's very unusual in a desktop yoke, and it makes for a more realistic package. Don't forget, what we're aiming for here is, you know, we're not turning this into an arcade game by giving all sorts of weird and wonderful special effects. We're striving for realism at every step of the way. We've got elevator weight, 200 degrees of travel, but there's something that you might not expect. We don't have any centering on the yoke, but we don't have any centering when we're at a standstill. But what you're going to notice once you're on the move is that centering force emerges as we pick up speed, because really that centering action is not artificially induced by a spring in a real aircraft. It's actually a consequence of the airflow resisting the displacement of the ailerons, and likewise the elevator. So let's go for a ride. Now, one of the things you might notice if you look in is the yoke's moving there as we go. Now this is in the realm of special effects to some degree. We do get some special effects on the ground. Cornering forces are transmitted through a roll movement of the yoke. Now, whether that's realistic or not doesn't matter. You get some feedback on the cornering. As we go, we're going to get bumps. Again, it's a sort of passable simulation of some kind of bumpiness. We also get forces when we brake, but the main thing to notice when we go through the takeoff, remember, is we're in the elevator's dead position at the moment, so the weight of the elevators is pulling the yoke forwards. As we get up to takeoff speed, what you should notice is the yoke should come back as the elevator moves in the airflow. Okay, so here we go, experimental takeoff. I'm controlling the rudder in case we leave the runway by mistake. We do have a little bit of a crosswind from the right. So the yoke's moving back on its own, and the yoke's now more or less in the central position. I'm going to put it on autopilot, indicated airspeed hold, heading hold. So I'm going to climb straight ahead. If I change the heading, you'll see the yoke is following the autopilot. So we've got less resistance on the yoke now because the speed's lower. 75, and we're going to start to flare about now. Just trying to keep it flying. There we go, we've got a bump through the yoke on touchdown. So that's the Iris force feedback yoke. We've now got it installed in the Twin Otter cockpit. It does make flying the Twin Otter different, but for now I think we've moved a step closer to a more realistic Twin Otter. So watch this space. I'm going to add gauges to my cockpit. These are gauges made specifically for the Twin Otter using Air Manager. I didn't make these gauges, I'm just testing them out for the guy who did. And we're aiming for a full set of gauges, or well, perhaps not quite a full set, but a comprehensive set to give most of what you need to fly the aircraft We've got the basic 6-pack and extra to date. We've got the nav instruments. The most significant omission at the moment is we don't have any engine instruments. So at the moment they're displayed in a very unrealistic manner. You know, you can't really fly with it like this. They're obscuring the virtual cockpit at the moment, but I just wanted to put them up on the screen so you can get a look. So of course, to introduce 2D gauges in a realistic manner to the cockpit, I'm going to need some extra screens, and that's going to take some pretty big re-engineering of the cockpit. I've got two Dell 20-inch, in fact 19.5-inch monitors, widescreen monitors on the way. Those are the smallest widescreen monitors I could buy. One of them is going to be for the main panel. It's going to go right here, slap bang in the middle of my existing cockpit. So I'm going to have to get rid of this. And we're going to put another screen down the left hand side, mostly for the engine instruments. This is going to have to go, this panel. I do need the autopilot panel, so I'm going to have to rebuild that. The autopilot panel could go here, so look out for that. I'm still stuck with this kind of narrow vertical field of view with my virtual cockpit, but once we've got a 2D panel we get much more effective use of the out of the window view. Even if I stick with the virtual cockpit, I'm going to do perhaps something with the track IR profile. Of course the main difference is I'm no longer going to need to be panning up and down just to see the instruments in the virtual cockpit. And just one final thing to say about the implications of mounting a screen here are that the yoke's going to have to come forwards a bit, and so my seating position is going to be slightly further back as well. This yoke, this is the Iris Dynamics yoke. It has about a 3-inch extension even when the yoke is in the fully forward position. So that's going to be enough hopefully for the screen, if you imagine the screen mounted here, to be mounted kind of quite low, almost to the point where it's touching the shaft. So it's 30 centimeters high, and the reality is it's going to intrude somewhat into the viewing area, but if I can mount it almost down to the yoke shaft, that's not going to be too much intrusion. So there it is. You know, that's just a heads up on some changes I'm going to be thinking about. You know, depending on how radical that gets, this cockpit could change quite a lot visually. I've got 2 screens mounted. These are Dell, just to remind you, 16 to 10 monitors, 19.5 inch, and I'm fairly happy with how they're mounted so far. Now I haven't powered them up yet. These are IPS monitors, so the viewing angle should be adequate for the instruments. This one should be no problem because it's pretty much square on to me. The monitor over at the side here, which is intended primarily for the engine instruments, the angle is going to be a bit more critical on that one. I've had to remove my dash for the moment. The dash doesn't fit. The dash sits along the top of this one, but this one protrudes up by about 5 or 6 centimeters. The panel that was mounted here, obviously it's gone. Rather than ditch that panel, I've put it up here. To do that, I've moved the start panel from over here to the left hand side, which is a fairly reasonable place for the start panel to be. It means I have to operate the flaps with my left hand instead of my right hand, or crossover, but everything else makes sense for it to be there. It's really been helpful. First of all, I made these panels in a kind of modular form. Everything pretty much is in multiples of 15 centimeters. So this panel is 15 high, 60 wide. The square panels are 30 by 30. This one's 15 centimeters by 30. Having them all built to that sort of grid system, if you like, means that you can actually take them out and swap them around without too much trouble. This panel up here, it's not ideal, you know. The fire panel being there, I've no problem with. The autopilot, I mean, it lets me use the autopilot without having to build another panel, which is what I thought I was going to have to do. I've tried flying it around a little bit and it works fine. It's just when you go for the autopilot, because I'm using the track IR, the view tends to pan up and down, which is a little bit ugly. And well, another thing about modularity and design, I made these panels, you may or may not remember, to be detachable. So they're all connected by umbilical cables connected with these RS232 connectors. And of course that means you can take them off, work on them, move them around, move them out of the way. Now that said, this little panel caused me a lot of trouble because the umbilical wasn't long enough, so I've had to take that and lengthen it by 1 meter. But it's fine, it works great. So just, you know, again, if you're going to do this kind of thing, all my bottom boards are mounted behind this wall here. I probably would have done well to design my umbilicals so that they all stretched from there to the furthest possible extremity. Now I was able to mount these monitors very easily, in fact, and this is a good reason. All things being equal, buying a Dell monitor is a good idea, and the reason for that is that Dell has a mounting system on most of its, well, I can't say most of its monitors, but certainly common on its monitors, which allows you to easily detach the monitor from the stand just by pressing a button and it comes off. And in each case I've used the original mounting plate, and if I just take this one off, you should see. So it just comes off easily like that. If you look on the back, if you ignore the tape for now, but there's a square there, and that just latches onto this plate which I've mounted onto my frame, and you can see there's two tabs there. It's a very robust plate and two little latching tabs at the bottom. So to put it back on, it's just the reverse of that, which I can't at the minute. There you go, I can feel it there. So that just clicked on, and there it is, so I can take those off. So yeah, just that's a vote for the Dell monitors there. Now of course if I start these monitors up and they look like crap, I'm going to retract that recommendation. I've arranged these screens deliberately with a gap here and a small gap here. I did think about buttoning them up over there and leaving a big gap here, but what I've done is I've left a big enough gap to fit these 10cm wide panels in comfortably with just a little bit of slack. Now I've got two of those already. This is the one for the head-up display. I've also got the one for the weather radar, and then this gap here I can put a small line of components down here, so a couple of switches, a couple of rotary controls, and I can do that without really building an acrylic panel. So there it is. Next step is to get these things wired up, power up the monitors, check the viewing angles, and then we're going to see what it looks like with the gauges on. You probably noticed I've changed a few things back. All these panels I moved around up here, I didn't like that. I couldn't really live with the autopilot up there, and so I've taken that away and I've returned the Elite radios and the start panel to their original positions. Now that means I've got no autopilot panel up there, so I've had to construct a new one, which is down here on the right hand side, close to where the autopilot indicators are going to be displayed. It's not done to the same standard as the rest of the panels. It's not made of acrylic, it's made of MDF covered in sticky plastic, but with the same components in, labelled up with Dymo labels. I used black buttons for most of these, and then I discovered I couldn't see them in the dark, so I've stuck these fluorescent labels on them. What are the changes? Well, the big obvious change is I have my panels powered up. Still not quite a full set of instruments here, but we've got pretty much all we need to fly the aircraft. We've got the engine gauges over here, we've got all the main instruments, we've got all the main indicators as well. The main annunciator panel, so if I fiddle with the generators, if I turn the generators off, I get the indicators there. What else? If I turn off a fuel pump, we get a warning. Turn on the backup fuel pump, that responds as we'd expect, and so on. So we've got everything we need. I'm still playing with the layouts and the sizes of these instruments, but it's pretty fantastic flying this around with real instruments. And I have to say these instruments are just beautifully done. I mean, I should give credit here to Russ Barlow from Sim Innovations. It was his idea to do this in the first place, and he's worked tirelessly, I have to say, on making these instruments not only accurate, but they just look perfectly in keeping with the original virtual cockpit instruments as well. There's still some wrinkles in how some of these things work, in particular the dependencies when some of the electrical systems are compromised. I think the most important thing that's still missing is the fuel gauges. We're going to have those probably over on the left hand side with the engine gauges as well. We've got plenty of real estate left on this monitor. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the instruments, and I'm not going to fly it around until it's finished, but then I'll obviously be doing some kind of more detailed look at the new cockpit in flight. I've tried to finish the dash in a kind of uniform way, so plug in the gaps and things. We've got a filler panel here, which I think I mentioned before. I've got the dash has been recut so that the monitor can fit in there. I've tried to fill the gaps here so there isn't anything too obtrusive, and I've got a panel here down at the bottom with the yoke coming through a hole there, so you can't actually see the body of the iris yoke either. So I'm pretty much back to where I was, but with instruments. So let's just go for a quick test flight. We're on the ground at Van Nuys. We're going to go up to Agua Dulce. And we're off. Get the flaps in, can take the auto feather off now. Make sure we're on GPS, then we can go to nav, hold. So we've got nav capture right away. Okay, speed's pretty good. We're going to land a little bit short actually. Alright. Too much talking, not enough flying. Let's go with the reverse. We've got a pretty comprehensive set of instruments now, and I'm happily flying the aircraft around on these. There's a few things still to be done, a few things to polish here and there, But by and large, I mean, I've hardly got any space left on the panel as well. You can resize these instruments, but I've resized them to the extent that I think is necessary to create a reasonable layout. Just one thing to say on the monitors, you'll remember I've got my engine panel on a monitor that's mounted in portrait orientation, and it is an IPS monitor, which means that the viewing angles are quoted as quite high, both in the vertical and horizontal directions. Now, that's not the whole story, and in fact, this monitor on the left, when I'm sitting in the cockpit seat, those gauges are starting to fade out. Now, interestingly enough, I've adjusted the contrast and the brightness of the monitors to be probably about half of what it was by standard. So when you first see them, you might think they look slightly dim, but the brightness and contrast levels are adjusted to be in keeping with the illumination of the cockpit. When I adjusted those brightness and contrast levels, the monitor on the left with the engine gauges on, as I say, started to fade kind of a little bit with the angle of view. If I move directly in front of it, everything is fine, the contrast is fine. I think what we're getting, because we've got a dark background and because obviously a lot of the detail of the gauges is dark, it's not so much that the monitor is fading, it's that the backlight is starting to, I don't know, I suppose scatter when we look at it at an oblique angle. Now this is the vertical viewing angle that's the problem here. Obviously it's horizontal because the monitor's been rotated into portrait orientation, but it's that vertical angle that causes the scatter. If I just explain it with this monitor, there's no such problem with the horizontal angle of view, so you can be way out to the right or the left, you know, within reason, and the uniformity of the monitor doesn't suffer. I think from memory the viewing angles are quoted pretty much similar values for the horizontal and vertical angles, and that just isn't true. So we do get this backlight scatter if we're off axis too much, and not by very much at all really, in the vertical direction or the horizontal direction when the monitor's on its side. To make things work really satisfactorily, this monitor, although it's tilted in slightly at the moment, it's only by about 5 degrees, it really needs to be tilted by about 20 degrees, maybe even more. You know, it's usable, it's perfectly usable the way it is, and it's kind of nice to have it flush with the dashboard. So we'll see. If I can be bothered to move that, I will. Now, people have asked me why I've still got the virtual cockpit on the screen now that I've got a full panel and all the instruments. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. If I just turn myself around and set things up so you can see, I'll talk a bit more about that. So I'm sitting in the cockpit ready to go. I'm just going to talk about the view at the front window. We've still got the virtual cockpit displayed. The reason for that is I want to use the track IR, and the reason I want to use the track IR is, you know, although I've got a wide view here, it's not that wide. You know, it's about 100 degrees wide optimistically, and it doesn't show me any side views. I don't have any side views in my cockpit. So I've still got the track IR in play, but what I've done is I've still got the full rotation in the yaw axis, so I can look out the side windows. I've still got the 6 degrees of freedom, so I can move right and left, up and down. That's glitching because the track IR's gone out of range of the sensor there, and I can move backwards and forwards to sort of look out the windows and so on. But what I've done is I've restricted the up and down movement, so we've still got some up and down movement, basically so I can kind of look out and up or sideways, and if I'm in that side, sideways and down when I'm flying. But I don't have a lot of up and down. I struggle to see the whole panel, but that's fine, I don't need to see the whole panel. So this is still a work in progress. I'm still tinkering with this. Now, people have asked me why I don't just use the outside view and dispense with the virtual cockpit altogether. Well, there's lots of reasons for it. Now, one reason is I think it looks good, you know, to have the cockpit walls and the superstructure available and blocking the view in all the appropriate places. I think that's a good feature. Of course, we've got some things that are quite handy to be able to see in the virtual cockpit. We've still got the magnetic compass here. We've got the flap indicator here. We've got the windscreen wipers here, although they don't actually do anything. Those are the only things we really need to see in the virtual cockpit. That said, having the window surrounds is also useful in judging our attitude when we're making a turn. So for example, I know that straight and level, pretty much with my default seat height, the horizon's going to fall just about the top of this flap indicator or the bottom of the pivot on the windscreen wiper. When I'm making a level left-hand turn, the horizon's going to cut the glare shield right about here. When I'm making a level right-hand turn, this corner of this thing is going to be on the horizon. You know, that's just a little set of pictures that you create that assist you in flying the aircraft. If you get rid of this virtual cockpit furniture, you've got to do it some other way. So that's another reason. Now, the outside view, it is possible to get a plain outside view in the aircraft. I think it is, if I cycle through these views. So this is the outside view And the track IR does turn it, so I could still use the track IR in the manner I've described. There's two problems with this. The first problem I've just described, which is we've lost the virtual cockpit furniture that allows us to make judgments about the aircraft attitude. The second thing is if you turn your head to the right, the cockpit suddenly appears, and the left likewise, and that's just very unrealistic. Now you could limit the track IR your axis, but we don't really want to. We sometimes want to look, that distance around to one side or the other. I'm going to continue to experiment with this. I'm not saying yes or no, but for the moment that's not the view that I'm choosing to use. At the moment I've swapped out the force feedback yoke for the Yoko yoke, which I've been reviewing. It does fit in the cockpit pretty well. What else? The other update, and you won't notice it unless I point this out, unless you're extraordinarily perceptive, this monitor works better. After I made my comments about how the viewing angle was causing a problem, two different people suggested to me independently that the vertical viewing angle is not the same from the top as it is from the bottom, and actually it's more favourable from the bottom. So if you tilt the monitor away from you in this orientation, you can tilt it further whilst still retaining a good image than if you tilted it towards you. So the upshot of that is I wanted to try taking this side monitor out and rotating it by 180 degrees. So that was almost painless to do. It wasn't quite painless. When you're mounting the thing on it, you need a little bit of clearance on one side to slide it onto the mount, and that clearance over this side was almost zero, so I had to set to with a chisel and chisel a little bit out of the frame of the cockpit. That's been very successful. It does indeed provide me with a better viewing angle for this monitor. The monitor was originally shimmed up using all these little washers. So it was shimmed up so it was tilted inwards and also upwards slightly. It's now completely flat and it's actually flush with this trim panel here, so that looks better. The other thing that I've been doing is playing with the layout of the instruments. Now, as I've said in the past, these gauges are created by Russ Barlow from Sim Innovations, really as kind of a flagship project to demonstrate the capabilities of Air Manager, and in particular to demonstrate the capabilities of accessing the LVARs in FSX and Prepared. Now, one of the slight difficulties with this is that Russ and I are working to different agendas. Really, I've got a hardware cockpit where I have all the switches, but really, the way forward for Air Manager is primarily to cater for touchscreen users. So with that in mind, Russ has built all of his gauges to support input via a touchscreen. And that means, just as an example, if you look at the autopilot gauge here, there's a toggle switch on it. And now if I had a touchscreen, I could flip that toggle switch just by touching the switch. But of course I've got the autopilot switch on my hardware panel. Now on this particular gauge it doesn't matter, it doesn't take up any extra real estate, but some of the other gauges, they take up more space than is strictly necessary for an output only device. Again, if we just looked over, for example, at the engine panel, we've got boost pump switches, we've got the emergency boost pumps, we've got the regular boost pumps, we've got the fuel selector switch, we've got the wing tank booster pumps, and all of the switches are redundant really in my particular cockpit. So why am I telling you this? Well, it's it looks nice, it's visually appealing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's causing a little bit of cramping when I want to squeeze things in. Case in point, Russ made a beautiful rendition of the Twin Otter's fire panel, but again, it's a bit of a mixed blessing for me because I've got the switches in my cockpit. Really all I want are the fire warning lights, and although that panel was very nicely done, it takes up too much space. To cut a long story short, I've been doing a little bit of tweaking as well as shuffling of gauges around, and I've come up with a slightly shaved down version of the fire panel which just has the indicators on, and also the test switch is visible there. And again, if it was a touch screen I would just touch it there, but so that's a slimmed down version of that particular gauge. And what else have I done? Oh yeah, the yaw damper, again Russ did the whole pitch and turn, the thumb wheel and the dial for controlling the manual mode of the autopilot, and the yaw damper on the same panel. Now that panel just took up more space than I was willing to give up really. So I've just done a little bit of hacking of my own and carved out that indicator light so I can put it in the centre of my cockpit. We're at Vernonia 05S. We're going to make a quick trip over to Barrow Field, 30 OR. Bit of a bump there. We don't need to be very high, we'll go up to I think 2,500 feet. We kind of go through the valley here. This is a tiny strip we're heading for. If you watch my recent Yoko review video, you'll have seen me do that in the Real Air Scout. We're going to do it in the Twin Otter today for a real challenge. It's barely long enough. On the left hand side, just down there. We're going to overfly it. We're going to want all the flaps for this strip, and we're going to try and fly it right on the minimum speed we possibly can. Well, we're about 70 at the minute. We need to slow down a little bit more, I think, or at least drop a little bit more height. Okay, I'm going to come up a little bit on the power just in case I need it. We're right on 67 knots or something. Just got to squeeze over these bushes. Power's there just if I need it. We're over the bushes, power off. Try and get a good flare. Then straight to full reverse and hit the brakes and steer as well, because we've got a bit of a kink in this strip. That was pretty good. We stopped it okay there. So there you go. That's what you can do with a twin Otter.